Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this penultimate session. And it has been a very interesting 2.5 days so far. I think a lot of discussion at all sorts of levels, from practitioners and academics through to talking about local governance structures, and now we have an opportunity to talk about the national level and what are national governments doing. Now, you might have noticed there's a typo in the program, so I better just explain that. It actually is not national Repossesses, participatory agendas as written, but it's actually national responses. So if anybody had any concerns about that, that is cleared up. This is obviously quite a complex issue. I should introduce myself. I'm the European coordinator for IFACCA. For those of you that don't know, IFACCA is the International Federation of Arts Councils and Culture Agencies. We work very much with our national members to help them in defining and improving and questioning their cultural policies and how they're working continually. And so after I've introduced my guests here, I might just reflect a little bit on that and what the national governments have been doing in terms of participatory governance. And then I will come back to my speakers. But first of all, I don't want them just to be sitting there unannounced. I know you have been introduced to some of the speakers already. So Milena doesn't need another introduction, I think. But thank you so much, Milena, for joining this session. You've been a fierce advocate for civil society for many years and a learned academic in this field. So your perspectives in this is going to be very valuable to us. For those of you that haven't met yet, Maanka Chipindi, he's the Director of Arts Council of Zambia, and we're so pleased that you flew all the way over. It was very important for us when we were defining this session that we wanted to get perspectives from beyond Europe, because we do have a tendency to be a bit Eurocentric in our thinking. And so it's very gratifying to see also other voices from other parts of the world during this conference. And I think you've done an excellent job at trying to ensure that we hear those voices. And I know the challenges around that and how difficult that is. So thank you very much. And I'm also very pleased to have Magnus Boström here from the Arts Council of Sweden. And Magnus is going to bring another perspective on this whole subject area, which has largely come from the very significant migratory flows that you've been witnessing in Sweden, and your responses to that and how you are trying to involve people in that discourse. And the person that you've all been waiting for, Dr. Nina Obuljen, our friend, colleague, somebody who has worked very closely in the cultural sector and in cultural policy research and has now stepped over to the dark side. She has. So she's now in the situation of being the Minister of Culture for Croatia. We're very happy that you've been able to find the time out of your very, very, I'm sure, hectic agenda to be able to be with us and talk to us today about the challenges from the government perspective. So just to go back a little bit and to talk about what we found from IFACCA, what we've seen is that this area is very complex and difficult. It's an area where really cultural context is key. But what we have noticed is, when we've conducted surveys of our national members, is that a number of members, a significant number of members, have held countrywide consultations and participatory processes to to inform their national cultural policy agendas. And I can just list a few of those. Belize, for example, conducted consultations for their national cultural policy that would go through from 2016 to 2026. Cyprus also organized public consultations for their strategic plans, but unfortunately those didn't proceed due to a change in government. So that's one of the challenges that you might imagine. Iceland conducted a consultation with stakeholders, but very specifically from the arts and cultural heritage fields, to inform their national cultural policy in 2013. Ireland, through its Department of Arts Heritage and the Gaeltacht plans, carried out a consultation for their national cultural policy that involved 600 people and 217 written submissions that were received. Malawi, in 2012, formed a committee to look at an existing draft of a cultural policy document and reflect on that for their national cultural policy strategy in 2015. Malta had extensive public consultations in 2020 for a cultural policy agenda that was published in 2011. Namibia have also conducted the drafting of over a two-day National Arts and Culture Conference in 2001, managed to draft together a cultural policy draft, but then it wasn't accepted by the cabinet. Again, another challenge. In England, they conducted a consultation in order to establish their policy for Arts Council England, which was published in 2010, called Achieving Great Art for Everyone, from 2010 to 2020 as a strategy document. So these are just examples. I'm not going to go on and on. I think probably the one that has stood out for us when I was talking about this subject with the new executive director of IFACCA, which is Magdalena Moreno, which actually she sends her love to all of you and her desire to have been here, but she couldn't be because of her board meeting in Kuala Lumpur, but she sends her regards. And she's actually from Chile herself and worked with the ministry in her previous life. So, and when we were in discussions about this, she said, oh, actually, one of the most interesting is actually from my own country, it's Chile. It's the only ministry that I know of, she said, that has a participatory governance structure embedded in law. So this is quite interesting. And I asked her why that was, and she said, well, I think it was a lot to do with the anxieties following a very long dictatorship, the idea that they wanted to separate government from government control of culture and to ensure freedom of expression for artists. But also because in the context of Latin America, she spoke about the fact that the people's voice is very strong. The idea of people power is very strong in Latin America. So it was kind of a natural conclusion that you should try to embed that somehow, even at the higher level. And so the new ministry has a board made up of civil society and, for example, unionists, universities, artist sectors, and associations. And interesting, the First Nations peoples. And in fact, on this latter point, there was a consultation process that was held nationwide with First Nations people. And that is probably the major contributing factor to why the Chilean ministry has recently changed its name. It is now called the Ministry of Cultures, Art and Heritage. So notice the S, the plural, cultures. So that's quite significant. I'm not going to go on any further because we've got much more interesting speakers to kick us off. Milena, you've had extensive experience working with intergovernmental bodies, looking at cultural policy and the application of cultural policy in a number of countries. Maybe you could start the conversation off now with a brief introduction to your experience at a government level of some of the challenges.
Because there are many different layers, different continents, different countries in each continent, so I don't know where to start with. But let's say I'm going to mention, express now those issues in regarding of my experience in Southeast Europe. Very concretely, I was sent by UNESCO to advise Albanian government on national policy strategy and the government of Republic of Srpska in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I was following closely what my government is doing in making national policy strategy in Serbia. I was on the task in UNESCO to help Cambodia developing national cultural policy strategy. And finally, I was on a civil society mission in Arabic countries where I helped in creating 12 cultural policy research groups, so groups that should enter in dialogue with the countries, with mostly MENA countries, and that is also very diversified experience. So, taking in account all this diversity, what I have noticed is the following. Let's say, contemporary obligation to create in a participative manner national cultural policy and strategy was in fact avoided by all governments that I have been close to in several ways. Most of them outsourced the task to one expert or to group of experts or to agency, or like my government, they gave this task to employees of the Ministry of Culture. When they finished drafts, those groups, experts or employees, this kind of draft was put on so-called public consultation. But as Professor Fischer was saying, if I remember still well, the space where public consultation is happening is also not neutral. Usually this space was space of, let's say, the national cultural institution in that city, mostly in capital city, but if to show nice attempt for decentralized discussions, for example, like in Serbia, in Novi Sad, it was in Matica Srpska, so again, national cultural institution. And the discussion was as a serial of speeches. So people would stood up. Of course, the order of those who applied for discussion was also carefully monitored. So the civil society came at the end, mostly when half of the room is already out after 3-4 hours, and where all the press and media are out. And that is more or less the system in countries that are really not there, probably multi-party democracies, like Cambodia theoretically is, but in fact, nearly all of them, including Republic of Srpska, including Albania, who has 2 parties fighting for power, but in the very moment one party is governing, then the power is, probably it's hard to say despotic, but it's total. And then even if the party got, 51% of the votes, they rule alone as they had 100%, as the whole people is behind. So this is my, first observation, that public consultations cannot replace participative process, and because even they are not in the real life a real public consultation, because then I monitored what have changed after public consultation, and of course only how I can say we say usually in our language cosmetic changes, just a little bit something, wordings and so on would change, but substantial change exactly related to the relationship of the state with civil society was not taken in account. However, I have to say that after 4 years of working in Cambodia, and now I will say something not because our colleague from Sweden is here, but the obvious change came when EU supported technical assistance mission was replaced by SIDA, technical assistance mission. Then SIDA was much more present, in fact representative of the Swedish agency, was much more present in monitoring processes, and process was established. And I have to say that yesterday in Phnom Penh was held the second art forum, a dialogue in between civil society and artistic community, which is already huge achievement. Even if not many things are going to be changed afterwards, the fact that in such a country, ministry is dialoguing with civil society, that civil society is invited in the ministry, even those members of civil society that are daring to raise the most complex questions. And those most complex questions in both Balkan and Cambodia are related to neglected segment of cultural policy, which is culture of memory and politics of memory, politics of conflictual, dissonant past, which usually in our cultural policy documents are not tackled because it relates to memory sites, it relates to monuments, and usually it is Ministry of, in our case, in Serbia it's Ministry of Social Affairs who is in charge. In some other countries it's Ministry of Defense, etc., etc. And all those civil society organizations who fight for not mainstream culture of memory are seen in most of the countries as enemy of the people, and they are not. So even if they invite artistic organizations from civil society, they will avoid to invite in Republic of Srpska, in I would say in Cambodia, they will avoid to invite people like Ritipan in Cambodia, who is questioning and collecting memory on the cruelties of Khmer Rouge. Now it changed. Now Bopana, which is memory center in Phnom Penh, and many others, okay, some that represents creative industries are there. Not to be very long, but I see now that I'm very long already. I wanted to stress importance of cultural policy research groups in Arabic countries, from Morocco till Jordan and even Yemen. And that's something which is really totally civil society endeavor, and it was supported by Al-Mavred and European Cultural Foundation, education of the people how to research cultural policy, because they didn't have, even if they would be sociologists, researchers, didn't have this skill to understand instruments of cultural policy, to, for example, analyze budgets of the ministries of culture, cities, other related ministries, and so on. So after this process, paradoxically, the best groups are in most totalitarian countries, like Algeria, for example, because for them it's the question of life and death. In Morocco we had two, how would say, competitive groups, but that's even better than not to have one. But in Tunisia, for example, who is flooded with European money, because it's the only country that succeeded after Arabic Spring to have so-called democratic government, whatever that means, they didn't succeed to produce any kind of, not document, but even a successful dialogue, because the point of this cultural policy research group is, which was, for example, a very well established in Egypt, dialogue in between sectors, public sector, so directors of public cultural institutions, civil society activists, and even those that might be nominated private entrepreneurs, music, creative industries, and so on. Unfortunately, after military coup, this work has to be stopped, and I don't know how this audience, are you aware or not, that majority of NGO from Egypt emigrated as NGOs in Lebanon, and most of the activists emigrated to Germany. So this is somehow not very visible due to the fact what's going on in Turkey, which is more visible, but throughout the Arabic country we have this now repressive policies, so no way of participatory dialogue, not even dialogue, but participatory cultural policies are out of the question. So yes, the liberation that we were speaking about are still far away of quite a lot of the countries, but I have to say something which might be interesting, that at least on the level of the region, ECOC, which usually had, from my standpoint, also quite a lot of criticism due to its populist and some other features, contributed quite a lot for establishment of participatory processes. In Novi Sad, for example, strategy of the city of Novi Sad was really done in a long process. So it took quite a long time, because if something is really participatory, it needs time. In spite of the very right-wing government in this moment in that city, in Banja Luka, the process started. I was 10 days ago. There were very, how would say, tough questions to the team of the future proposal of cultural capital. So it was obvious that in the room were people of different political views, political options. They exactly questioned politics of memory, how the city as cultural capital is going to deal with exodus of Bosniaks and Croats from Banja Luka in 1992 and so on. And it was taken and responded, which I think is already, because up to now, this kind of discussion would be stopped and closed and just no way. So I can stop on this level. There are, maybe just one more line. One of the potentially biggest instrument for participatory cultural policy making is quadriennial periodic report of Convention 2005, which explicitly demands involvement of civil society. Up to now, in most of the Western Balkan countries, civil society was never involved, neither in Cambodia, in writing the report, but few experts, and that's it. So it's, although it said, so this is something that we could use as a promotion, as a tool to really ask more concretely and precisely for the involvement of civil society in this process.
Great, thank you, Milena. Milena, you've raised a number of questions for me about what is the big problem in terms of inviting participatory processes? Is it fear of lack of control? Or is it another issue which is to do with the cultural context or possibly the fear of, well, are we going to just open up more demand for the poor resources that we have? We have so little resources. Are we opening up a process where people will just expect that there's a possibility for more, and then we just get ourselves into sticky waters again when they realize there are no resources to go around anyway? I don't know. Maybe we could get some different perspectives on this from Adrian. Maanka, actually, to introduce you, I've always known you as Adrian, but Adrian was his westernized name, and now I'm going to have to get used to Maanka. and I like it better. So thank you, Maanka, for coming and telling us about some of the challenges that you face.
Yeah, thank you, Diane, and thank you, Milena. I agree that a number of interesting issues have been brought up. I'll try to stick to the Zambian experience in terms of some of the challenges and some of the issues, I think, around the participation. In the Zambian situation, obviously, we have to a certain level demands by the statutes that create, for example, the National Arts Council, that there should be consultations with the stakeholders. But one of the immediate issues is that the statutes which create the National Arts Council do not already define who the stakeholders are. So what that means is that it's up to us to decide who we can bring around the table as stakeholders. And then secondly, the statutes don't even explicitly say what level of participation. Is it consultation? Is it just informing them? Is it engagement? What would you consider participatory? I think those still miss. So you find that there's still a bit of room for us to go around some of these things. But in a nutshell, you find that the National Arts Council Act, the act which established the National Arts Council, is very clear in terms of how we should make certain decisions and how we should constitute, for example, our board and that kind of thing. For example, the act does say that our board should be made up of what I would call civil society organizations, but that's another thing I wouldn't want to go into. But it says that we should be made up of civil society organizations, and these civil society organizations should choose who sits on the board. We have no say in that as a council. And then when they choose the people who sit on our board, they even elect the chairperson to that board, they elect the leader to that board, and we have no say in that. But then, so long as we're able to define who the stakeholders are and we're able to define the level of participation, there's still that challenge. So, in terms of the Zambian experience, I think I will narrow down the challenges to a few thoughts which I just put together very quickly. There's so much paper here. I think the first thing we find is that there's very little information and in terms of what information is available to the public for them to be effectively involved in the participatory processes. So, for example, if we say a cultural policy, a few years ago, I think 2013, we tried to consolidate the sector. So we began these national consultative processes. We went to the provinces. We brought different people together and tried to make sure that everyone understands what is going on. Towards the end of the process, as we were about to finalize the establishment of a commission, the National Arts Culture Heritage Commission, a few stakeholders came back and said, no, we are not sure about this because our benefits are not clear. So I think the availability and the lack of availability of information undermines the ability for people to effectively participate. The other thing is that, I don't know in other African countries or in other countries, but there's a bit of, most of the organizations are not very flexible. Most government agencies are not very flexible because they are often created based on acts of parliament, which before you change them, you have to go to the parliament and that kind of thing. So most of them are not very flexible, and it's a bit difficult to react quickly to certain situations. So I think that's something that is which is there. And for Zambia specifically, I think what has been lacking is the benefits of participatory governance are not very clear, and even lessons which have happened in other places are not clear. So in the absence of, I know other things, for example, IFACCA has done well in developing toolkits for different scenarios, maybe toolkit for engaging the businesses. I think we need something, maybe a toolkit for participatory governance of some sort, so that even when we are engaging in participatory governance, we have something to refer to. And maybe finally, we have to see participatory governance in the context of other systems. For example, if the general government system in place is not participatory, or there is no participatory philosophy in that context, then it's a bit challenging for one sector to just be participatory. So you have to look at it in a much wider sense. And I want to end by making a comment on something that Milena said. I think, and this has come out, what kind of skills do the people who want to participate bring on board? Do they have enough understanding of the issues? Are they able to, and I've called this throughout this conference, I've called this, what is their capacity to participate? And how can, as a government agency, how can we create that capacity for them to participate and to be involved? I thought maybe I throw out those few things. Thank you. Yeah.
Is it on? Oh, yes. Thank you very much, Maanka. Big challenges, and I like the idea. I'll take that back to Magdalena for a toolkit to help support in giving ideas or recommendations on how to follow some participatory processes. You also raised a question right at the beginning, which was, who do you involve? Who's involved in, who do you give a voice to? And who do you talk with? Because this is all about giving voice to different groups and crucially listening. I think, Magnus, you might be able to enlighten us a little bit on what you've been doing, the work at the Arts Council of Sweden, and how you've been including different voices in the dialogue.
Yes, as I'm going to show a short video clip, can I come back? Does this one work? Yeah? I mean, it's Friday, so it's nice to see a little video clip, I think. So let me start with saying a few words before I show this little video clip. I'm Magnus. I'm living in Stockholm, and I'm very happy to be here, that you invited me to this beautiful city. The climate is like summer for me, so I'm really enjoying it. I've been with the Swedish Arts Council since two years, and the Swedish Arts Council is a public authority under the Swedish Ministry of Culture, and whose task is to promote cultural development and access to culture. The Council achieves this by allocating and monitoring state fundings to culture. The duty of the Swedish Arts Council is to carry out and put into effect the cultural policy determined by the Swedish government and the Parliament. The core of the goal of the Swedish cultural policy is to increase access for all who live in Sweden, and that is access to culture, both via contact with culture of high quality, but also through creative activity by their own. With this as a platform, the project Creative Places, that we're soon going to see a short clip of, was initiated by the Swedish Ministry of Culture. The Swedish Arts Council allocates 100 Swedish crowns, and that is approximately 10 million euros over a 3 years period. So it starts from 2016 and continues to 2018. It goes to projects across the whole of Sweden that carry out cultural activities based on the needs of local residents. And it has to be in collaboration with the local stakeholders. Those who live in the area has to be involved as project participants, otherwise they will not get any funding. The goal with this activity is to is to enable more people to choose, create and enjoy culture where they live. So now I'm going to show a short movie, it's just 4 minutes, and it's from a startup meeting with the Happy 27 project that we picked out from 200 applicants.
Kreativa platser är ett bidrag och har syftet att lyfta det befintliga engagemanget som finns i olika bostadsområden runt om i Sverige. Och meningen är att boenden ska ha möjlighet att driva kulturlivet på platsen där man bor.
Idag ska vi genomföra en uppstartsträff för satsningen Kreativa platser. Det kommer komma deltagare från 27 olika projekt från hela landet.
Kreativa platser är viktigt därför att Sverige behöver mer kultur till fler. Sverige behöver mötesplatser och vi som bor här behöver sammanhang. Vi behöver lära känna varandra.
Att våga utgå från människor och våga utgå från och ha tillit till att människor själva är de bästa på att identifiera sina egna behov till förändring. Vi måste våga tro på att individer tillsammans kan lösa och göra. Och det finns liksom inga omvägar, för det kostar också. Det kostar i kronor, det kostar i mod att våga prioritera det. Och det kostar i att man ibland gör fel.
Vi kommer att få resa här inne idag. En omvänd Nils Holgersson-resa som börjar i norra Sverige och tar oss från Luleå och Hertsön ner till Malmö.
Vårt projekt Lyssna på oss är ett projekt där vi ska fånga upp känslan i samhället. Vi är ett samhälle där det har varit mycket neddragningar, så att nu vill vi vända det och nu ska det bli en positiv anda.
När vi pratade med boende i området Gärdet så var det att en känsla av att det kommer att smälla eller brinna i Bollnäs inom 10 år. Och det var där någonstans vi började samtalet. Projektet handlar om området Gärdet där vi har olika startprocesser eller träningsläger eller vad man nu kan kalla det. I olika konstnärliga uttryck eller mötessituationer där alla de mötena har en grundkraft i sig att vilja nå till en gestaltning eller en praktik.
Vårt projekt går ut på att vi ska starta en kulturförmedling i Fittja där man kan komma och testa på saker och sen aktivera folket i området. Vi tror på kultur som initieras av medborgaren själv och hens drömmar och idéer.
Bidraget från Kreativa platser, det gör ju nästan allt. Vi skulle aldrig ha kunnat göra det här utan det. Vi är uppvuxna i Fittja. Idag har vi också barn i Fittja. Och vi vill ge dem det bästa. De ska inte gå miste om något bara för att de bor där de bor.
Vårt projekt heter Akademin och görs i samarbete mellan Pantrarna, Konstfrämjandet och TNB som är en förening i Bergsjön. Akademin är en postkolonial skola där vi för en befriande pedagogik utifrån behov och intressen som vi ser bland deltagarna. Det är vi som gör det av oss och för oss. Vårt projekt är viktigt för att det är en tid där vi ständigt definieras av andra och där vi har ett arv av en rasistisk och kolonial historia. Icke-vita personer och förorterna hela tiden avhumaniseras och våldet blir mer och mer legitimt. Och därför är vårt projekt väldigt viktigt för att lyfta vår kraft och vårt engagemang och låta oss själva definiera oss själva, våra områden, intressen och behov.
Projektet har givit mig och min organisation otroligt mycket. Det är en ungdomsförening som jobbar väldigt mycket med ungdomar. Men det här är ett chans för oss att få jobba med alla boenden. I vårt projekt så kommer vi skapa ett nätverk. Tanken är att vi på sikt vill utverka en vandringsföreställning i området där vi tar platser så folk aldrig lägger märke till och använder dem som våra scener där vi lyfter platsens berättelser.
Det är nu allting börjar egentligen. Uppstartsträffen är klar, 27 projekt har fått pengar, beviljats bidrag för att genomföra sina idéer. Och jag har en massa hopp om att det här kommer bli en fantastiska verksamheter utifrån all den energi som de har visat under dagen. Det har varit helt fantastiskt.
Thank you on behalf of my colleagues. I would like to quote our Minister of Culture, Alice Bah Kuhnke, who you saw in the clip. She said, it costs in courage, that is one thing. We have to be confident that people themselves are the best one fitted to know what they want and need. We have to have the trust that individuals can solve problems and get things done. The second one is that it costs in mistakes. Leave the prestige behind. Share your best mistakes and learn from them. And the last one is that it costs money. Dare to invest. With this project, we expand the public funding ecology with a new dimension. The funding of institutions creates stability. The funding of participatory-driven projects creates outcome and change and development. And we need both. When culture becomes individual engagement, it makes difference. You become a part of a bigger scope. You learn more about yourself, and you learn more about others. And I think you develop your creativity, and the culture becomes relevant to you. And in the end, I think it's about being a complete person. So that's why we are working very hard with this.
Oh, thank you very much for that. I think you've done an amazing job in Sweden in making sure that as many voices can be heard as possible, and that's particularly challenging at a time when you've experienced such high immigration flows and changes in demographics, and at the same time very crucial to do this at this time. And it's very important to build that. Also, the sense of solidarity amongst people, that we're in it together. And we were often talking during this conference about what this actually means, this participatory approach. And does that mean that we have shared responsibility? So we also have shared responsibility for the lack of resources, but and to overcome the lack of resources. So I think it's a very positive example. Now turning to our culture minister, Nina, I made a joke at the beginning that you'd moved over to the dark side, but that was partly because we do have this tendency or perception to talk about the policymakers as if they're, the big, bad, ugly people who are stopping anything from happening. And so it's very gratifying to see somebody from the arts sector move into this post. I mean, it was a joke for many years in the UK that the culture minister was always the person who hated culture most, because they would have to push through all the cuts, all the budget cuts. So it's so nice to have somebody who does care about culture be in the ministry. But I'm sure it's still not without its challenges. And I'd really like to invite you now to tell us a little bit about your perspective in this new post, because it's a year, less than a year, that you've been in this post. And I'm sure it's been quite a roller coaster ride for you as well. So thank you, Nina.
Thank you, Diane, for this nice introduction about being on the dark side. I suspect I'm the only one in this room. But first of all, it is quite a challenge to step in at the end of the conference, where I know that you've spent quite a number of hours discussing the topic, and then come at the end, fly from completely different topic, and try to say anything meaningful. So I hope that this will be taken into consideration. So based on what I heard so far, especially with the last example that we saw, I think, at least from my perspective as a Minister of Culture, when we talk about participatory or participation in decision-making or influence on different processes, it is quite different if we talk about community levels and if we talk about the impact at the national levels, because the processes that you want to have impact on are quite different. So the idea behind is the same, but I would say the approach, the methodology, and the way how to stimulate discussion in the context of local community engagement, which is always, in my view, at least going to first look at the citizen and the individual, and the processes that you are managing when you are talking about participatory processes at the national level, they are quite different. And of course, from my perspective, I will try to focus on this second one. So when I was listening to previous interventions, I started making notes, and I would like to try to look at this process at several different levels. When we are talking about national cultural policy processes and decision making and the changes, again, if we want to involve different constituencies, partners, stakeholders, or even individual citizens, again, the approach, in my view, is quite different if we are opening up the discussion about some policy or strategic issues. If we are involving stakeholders to participate in the decision-making process when we talk about financing, and also as the third very distinctive segment is how to involve citizens, organizations, individuals in the legislative processes and procedures. In my view, trying now to deduct and think about processes that I've been involved, and just for those of you that are not from Croatia, I've been on the dark side before already, and I had a position of state secretary in the ministry for 6 years, so this is not the first time that I crossed the line. So I have a number of experiences from that time on the involvement. So I would like to share with you a couple of examples of success stories and not so successful stories that might lead us to further discussion or some conclusions even. So again, going back to this division, and of course you are free not to agree with this distinction, but for me it is really quite different. Talking about policy level and referring to what Milena said at the beginning, again, it is quite different if you are trying to stimulate the discussion and participation in the process of adopting a strategy or a new policy. And you listed a number of countries that had a public consultation, and in my view, regardless if you launch this process internally within the ministries or the government, or you give it to someone else, if you do not ensure that this process is participatory, it's a dead end. Even if you include, it can be a dead end. But if you do not include all relevant stakeholders, it is definitely not going to be any kind of policy or strategy that would bring you. It can eventually bring you to the end of your mandate, but it cannot have any long-term impact, and you can't ensure continuity. The other element of this policy strategic is the element of monitoring, evaluation, research, which is, in my view, also a very important element when we talk about participatory policy making, or and there you mostly delegate this to different kind of groups of experts, professionals, consultants, organizations, and I think that majority of cultural policies today and decision makers would opt for that kind of involvement, and this is becoming a standard. Of course, it is a question of resources, human resources, financial resources, how you are going to operate these procedures. But this is very important, because if you want people to be involved in to participate in the creation of priorities, policies, strategies, you have to make them understand that eventually there will be some professional and objective evaluation of the results of the whole process. If I can be also a little bit critical of the situation in Croatia, which I hope that with our humble contribution, being on the dark side, we will be able to deal with, is that we very much lack this segment of the monitoring of the results of everything that we do. The second aspect is the second part where traditionally you are seeking involvement of different stakeholders is the legislative process. But of course, this process, no matter how hard you try to involve as many stakeholders as you can, and there we are talking both equally about professional organizations, different arts and culture organizations, but also individuals, different interest groups. At the end, the legislative process also has its element which very much depend on the politics and the context and what you can push through and what you can't push through for different kinds of reasons. So this is a process where a responsible politician would very carefully listen to all the contributions and opinions, but at the end, you sometimes have to make some choices which do not necessarily reflect what was a general understanding in the debate because of some other elements that are part of this process. And of course, something that probably was the first element of cultural policy, which we in majority of country opened for different involvement of stakeholders, is the decision making when it comes to financing, and I think that we should never neglect this element of participation. In Croatia, we have in fact both involvement at the level of the ministry through the system of councils, but also two examples of arm's length institutions, which are themselves again open for participatory processing in all these elements that I mentioned. On their level, on the level of strategy, and here I'm talking, for instance, in Croatia about Croatian Audiovisual Center or the Foundation Kultura Nova, which brought you all here. So if we then go from the level of the ministry to the level of these arm's length organization, you can see that they are involving all stakeholders again in all these three processes, when they are defining their policies and strategies, when they are bringing about their own legislation and rules, and also in the decision-making process. This brings me to the results of the participatory involvement that we have experienced in Croatia so far, and which I am now experiencing in our efforts to be more open and to open to different, to open discussion on different agenda that we are dealing with. For instance, these two examples that I mentioned, reform of the Croatian audiovisual legislation and practices, and the development of the Foundation Kultura Nova, both of these processes started as a bottom-up initiatives. These were not initiatives of the government. Both of them were, I can say, started as an initiative from the professionals or stakeholders that felt that this would bring them, that this would be a better model of organization. And then the government at that time happened to be open to accept this. We had also some negative examples, which for obvious reasons I'm not going now to talk about in too many details, because there might be also, I don't want to be misinterpreted, but for instance, a few months ago we launched a discussion because we need to work on fundamentally redefining the whole legislation around the status of the artist in Croatia, both in terms of policy, financing, rights, because the system is simply not adequate. But when we opened discussion on this issue, we did not receive so far a general reflection on the system, on the need to reform the system, but mostly very particular interest of very particular organizations that think that any reform will reduce their rights and that they want to keep what they have. Why I'm mentioning this? Because I think in order to have a successful process of involving stakeholders, you have to be very strategic about the processes, that how you are going to manage the process, how you are going to send your message, and what are you going to put in front of the public as a material or ideas for discussion. And this, at least in my experience, I find as one of the most challenging tasks, because you need to prove credibility, and you need to prove that your intentions are those that you are trying to open consultations about. We had another example, for instance, this year in Croatia, with a very severe crisis in the publishing industry, where at one moment almost 40% of our book market was out of job. It when the biggest distributor got bankrupt, and this created a huge problem for our publishers, this and that. So in this, in trying to manage, I can't say that we as the ministry resolved this crisis, but we were managing this whole process. And in the situation of a crisis, if you do not open discussion with all the stakeholders and partners, you definitely can't achieve anything. So if at the end of this year we see the light at the end of the tunnel, and we see that we are turning around the trends which seemed as if they are going to make the whole publishing industry disappear, it is exactly because the whole process was managed in parallel between all the key stakeholders and the government. What I'm trying to look also is a question of principles. And I was not thinking about this before, but when I was listening to your earlier interventions, I think it is very important to promote some principles on the involvement of the citizens, organizations, artists, other stakeholders, other partners, other sectors. By the way, yesterday there was a big international conference on creative sector in Zagreb, and we actually had the two speeches from the Minister of Finance and Minister of Culture, which was talking about different sectors. This was very much appreciated. I wish I could have brought Minister of Finances here today again, but he can't do it 2 days in a row. But we should never forget that involving other sectors is also crucial for many aspects, many elements of cultural policy. But I'm trying now to think about these principles, and I suspect when I saw the program, if I was with you for the past 2 or 3 days, I would have for sure think of many more. One is a confidence, and not only of those who need to be to open up to the consultation process and participatory processes, but also those who are participating in these processes. And this is what I have in mind when I say you need to get involved in the process, not only by trying to defend your own particular interests, but trying to look at the broader issue. And I think this is one of the elements or one of the factors that makes many participatory processes not successful, because by definition, or by generally speaking, and this is what came out from your introduction again, those who are at the government side would be on the dark side, and those who participate in the participatory processes, they are always super positive about the process, which is definitely not the case. Very often through these processes you get very particular interests wrapped up in something that might seem as a contribution to the broader, to a more general. The other principle or the other prerequisite is a capacity to get involved in the dialogue. Very often you lack a good mediation to achieve a dialogue, and then very soon in the process somehow the opinions and the positions that might seem so distant from each other that if you do not have good mediators and ability to get involved in the dialogue, the process simply cannot develop in the way it needs to develop. And of course this element, as I said, and this I really think that it is very important to try to look, regardless of your particular interests and agenda, to always try to look at the broader issue, because at the end, any move forward is always has to be a consequence of some sort of a dialogue and a compromise. So my experience is that if you are open and if you try to follow these principles, it might take time, it's always longer, but you actually can create situations and you can adopt policies or make decisions that are actually going to be more legitimate because they are a consequence of a much broader process. And just to conclude, or not to conclude, to finish, I'm not concluding anything, just to finish my intervention, I always, when I reflect on this, I always remember of this small booklet that I'm sure that all of us read about the 21 dilemmas in cultural policy, where we actually see how this whole process of participating in culture and cultural policy making and any kind of reforms that you try to introduce is always a process of dialogue. And I think it's very interesting and very helpful, even if I was not here, but many stakeholders that we will be in dialogue with on different issues. I would really like to commend the Foundation for picking up this topic. We live in a society which was in the past few years and it is still now infected with a very high level of intolerance, coming from different kinds of ideas, groups, political or ideological spectrum, and any effort to talk about participation and dialogue and ability to respect the opinion of the other, I think, especially for us in the field of culture, is a great benefit. So thank you very much for picking up the topic.
Okay, that was a wonderful intervention, and I hope it was recorded because I think it could form the basis for that toolkit that you were wanting, Maanka. So it's certainly a starting point, and definitely a lot of food for thought. We're running out of time, and I'm very mindful of that. So have we got 5 minutes for some questions? So anybody with a burning question, this is your opportunity. Nobody wants to speak. Isn't that strange? Doesn't that always happen? And when I say that the session is concluded, it'll change. Oh, yes, we have somebody.
I guess I wanted to pick up on that point about who are the stakeholders, because within that, I think it was quite unclear at times exactly what you were saying then at the Nina about the vested interest of whether we're talking about the stakeholders being the artists or whether we're talking about the stakeholders as the wider public. And I think, so I suppose I'm kind of just picking up that there were a few references to arm's length being necessarily more participative than ministry approaches, and I would question that. I would say that actually they can be more as problematic in terms of being closed worlds. But then I also wanted to kind of relate to Magnus's example of Sweden, because in England we also have creative people and places, and I know that the two programs are speaking to each other. And I guess it's that question that, Nina, you were saying about, well, it's different if you're talking about locally and nationally. And of course the question, I suppose for me and from creative people and places is, are they projects and experiments in small places, or are they an alternative model of doing cultural policy that actually we know people participate most in culture locally, but we fund centrally? And I suppose I'm kind of just throwing out, is that a model that actually should challenge the very way that cultural policy is done?
Okay, before they answer that question, is there another question from the floor? And we'll take two together. No more questions from us? So, questions of perception? Questions? Well, I guess the two arts councils in this case.
Yes, I think you have to help me a little bit with what was the question. Sorry?
Would it be possible to money? That's what I understood, because money is delivered centrally to the cities. Could money be dislocated and then deliberated locally? Would that be more democratic?
The projects that get this money, this 100 million crowns, it's a mixture of organizations, of different organizations. So it has to be a partnership configuration. A blend of voluntary organizations, culture institutions, municipality organizations, and social movements and networks. So every project is representing a unique set of ideas that comes from the local resident where it comes from. I'm not sure if it was an answer on the question, but. Yes, that's one of the main challenges is for the Swedish Arts Council. As a public authority, we have to be reliable, we have to be predictable, and we have to be stable. At the same time, we have to adapt, be resilient, and be willing to change. And that is, I think that's the hardest part for us right now, to have this balance between stability and willingness to change.
Okay, can I just add to that, in that we had the European members meeting of IFACCA at the end of September. Your chair was at that meeting as well. And what was very interesting there was they were talking very much about a similar topic. As you have been talking about, we need to make a better case to the policy makers and so on. They were talking about, it's not about making a case to the policymakers, it's about making a case to the public, because the public are the ones that are now influencing the policy decisions. They have much more information about where their tax is going. They want to have a word in that. And this is a dangerous area that we're in, because unfortunately the public perception is quite low in many countries about the impact of the arts in their lives. And despite the fact that many people will participate in the arts on a daily basis by reading a book or watching a film, or listening to music, they don't correlate that with public investment in the arts very often. And the conversation around the table there was, how do we get the civil society, the public, to understand the value in investing in the arts as a platform for developing new content, for risk-taking, etc., etc. Because if we don't, the mainstream things that they're used to seeing may not be as diverse or interesting as they once had. And I think the CEO of Arts Council Ireland said, you have to remember that Billy Elliot was funded by the Arts Council initially. It was considered quite a new and innovative play. It is now a West End hit, but nobody thanks the Arts Council for that original risk-taking in that director and new piece of work. And so the question is, are we rather terrible as an art sector in actually reminding the public of the value of what we do in the public sector? So that was just thrown in. Adrian, you wanted to add something?
Yes, I wanted just to throw in something in terms of her question, which I think is a very important question. We found as the Zambian Arts Council, though we don't have a lot of money to decide whether we're putting in the center or what, but we found from experience that when we fund sort of rural-based groups, our impact is much more stronger, I think, and we have a better impact. But naturally, because we are structured in a very centralized manner, when we are engaging, we find it much more effective to engage with central structures, maybe cities or provinces, but we really don't go into the rural places. So I agree with her that it might be more effective to learn that just as participation is more effective in the outskirts and at the community level, even funding should follow that. And yes, we've seen that experience, but we find that in terms of capacity to participate and to engage, it's much more effective in the central places. Okay, thank you. I've seen the signs.
Okay, yes, I'm being waved at. I know there were other questions on the floor, but I'm afraid we don't have time because our minister needs. You're okay for a little bit, 5 minutes more? Okay, quickly then. Mike? A mic for Mike.
So this is probably not the question to ask at the end of 3 days of talking about participatory governance in culture, but if we look at participatory governance in the world and essentially democracy, what it has delivered in the last while, Brexit, Trump, the rise of right-wing governments in many parts of Europe and the like, why do we believe that participatory governance in culture will necessarily be a progressive thing?
Oh, now that's a good question to finish on. So,
okay. Who paid the ticket for Mike van Kamp here? Well, I think, Mike, even if there are, I think there is much more as an element, and of course there is no time now to look into it in details, but it is my firm belief that it is not the problem in democratic process. I think we all have to hold very strong to it. I think in these situations we very much have to look at the role of media in these participatory processes. And I think that, at least this is my opinion, that in these times of a fake participation of individuals, especially through social media, we are very much changing the landscape in which we engage in a way which is not representative anymore, but can be very loud by some groups who are simply very much present in certain media which are dominating the public discourse. So in my view, we shouldn't give up we shouldn't give up on in our opinion that participation and participatory governance is important. We simply have to admit that we do not have channels of communication which are adapt to what is actually happening in the public space today. But this is, of course, just my personal opinion.
I will just add to it. I think there are many reasons why we have still to lobby for participatory governance in culture. First of all, because it is exactly, when we look this Swedish example, for example, it's not that all community is asked. It's engaged community through NGOs, through different sorts of association that is asked to submit projects. In this sense, there is, in this region, for example, specifically I think in Croatia and Serbia, it's a huge competence of civil society in cultural policy making. It's not everywhere in the world, but we started quite a long ago, end of 90s, beginning of this millennium, to do on extensive capacity building, that's what you mentioned, capacity building of civil society for cultural policy making. And now we have huge, for example, girls that just left for Belgrade, they've been making, from NGO sector, making very competent analysis of the problems in another type of decision making, this evaluation of projects within juries. And that was the case where the jury members for contemporary dance, that was the issue. And I want to give you an example to show that we need two capacity building processes. One is for cultural policy decision making, other is for evaluation of not art projects only as art projects, but also as cultural projects. Why? For example, the jury for contemporary dance gave 75% of the budget for contemporary dance to one festival. Why? They said we followed the instruction of the ministry, and they said priority given to projects that fundraised more than 50% of their budget. Contemporary Dance Festival fundraised 15 million euros, and they asked 5 million, and that's it. That was the budget for contemporary dance. So then we said to the jury who made this decision, why we need festival if we don't have production? Why we need festival if we don't have distribution of contemporary dance? If we don't have critical texts about critics and so on? You have to have. Here, those days, everybody was speaking about ecosystem. I don't like this word. I would say socio-cultural cycles completed from needs through production to dissemination, access, and so on. And then when we have this completed, then that's quality cultural life. So we need also education for decision making, so that the people who evaluate projects do not evaluate only because the value of this festival, contemporary dance, was really excellent. Best dance companies from the world. So that's not the question. They knew to evaluate what's best. But you have to have cultural policy knowledge, and that knowledge has to be both in the ministry and in civil society for a dialogue.
We're going to add that to the toolkit as well. So, thank you very much. I'm being told by the organizer I'm going to never be invited to moderate a session again. So, so I'd just like a big round of applause for our four panelists.